What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 3 Final Look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 3. Let's take a look at this final look video here, going through each position. I'm going to give you my top plays, my value plays. So let's get into it here. Okay, so at the quarterback position, I like Russell Wilson from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Russell Wilson has averaged 34.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4 rush attempts per game. He scored 34 and 35 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks of the season. He got 5 rush attempts last week. He's going to be about 13% owned here. He's projected at 23.2 fantasy points here in Week 3, but I think he should score at least 25 fantasy points here in this matchup. He's $7,300 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 57 points scored in this game, so a super high scoring game with the Seattle Seahawks favored by 5. So Dak Prescott is a great play here as well, and Dak is projected to be trailing here, but remember Dak Prescott, he's got a stud running back in Ezekiel Elliott, and Russell Wilson has more of a passing down back with Chris Carson. So I'm going to give the edge a little bit here to Russell Wilson, and he's only 100 salary more, both on DraftKings and FanDuel. So you can play either of these guys here, Dak Prescott or Russell Wilson, but I like Russell Wilson here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, now for a lower ownership quarterback play here, I like Matt Ryan from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Chicago Bears, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Matt Ryan has averaged 28.2 fantasy points per game on the season, rushing an average of 2.5 times per game. He scored 29 and 28 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks of the season. He's only going to be about 3% owned here, and he's projected at 19 fantasy points here in Week 3. Again, I think that projection is a little bit low. I could see him scoring 25 plus fantasy points, even though this isn't a good matchup here. The Chicago Bears have a good defense, but the Atlanta Falcons are a pass-first offense. They got plenty of weapons on the offensive side for Matt Ryan. He's $6,600 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47 points scored in this game, with the Atlanta Falcons favored by 3.5. So a relatively close game here. So I like Matt Ryan here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I like Derrick Henry from the Tennessee Titans playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Derrick Henry has averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 28 rush attempts per game and 2.5 pass targets per game. He only scored 8 fantasy points last week off of 25 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. With that kind of volume, I think this guy is just waiting to have an explosive game here. I think it comes here in Week 3. He's got a fantastic matchup versus a bad Minnesota defense. He's going to be about 16% owned. He's on the field for 73% of the snaps, touches the ball 58% of that time. So monster usage rate, monster volume here. He's projected at 18 fantasy points here in Week 3. He's 7,800 DraftKings salary and 400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 3. So a high-scoring game, could be a favorable game script if the Titans get out ahead of the Minnesota Vikings. Either way, Derrick Henry is going to get a ton of work. I think he explodes here in week 3. So I like Derrick Henry here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Another running back I like here is Jonathan Taylor from the Indianapolis Colts, playing the New York Jets, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jonathan Taylor has averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 17.5 rush attempts per game and 4 pass targets per game. He scored 22 fantasy points last week off of 26 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. He's going to be about 27% owned here. He's projected at 17 fantasy points here tonight. He's here in week 3. He's 7,000 DraftKings salary and 300 less on FanDuel. So I like that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game, and they have the Colts favored by 11.5. So this could be a running game script. If the Colts go ahead in this game, they run a bunch of Jonathan Taylor to run out the clock. It's a great matchup. Nice game script here. He got a ton of volume last week. I think that continues here in week 3. So I like Jonathan Taylor here versus the New York Jets. And maybe my favorite running back on the slate, if you consider everything, price, ownership, matchup, I like Austin Eckler from the LA Chargers, playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Austin Eckler has averaged 14.3 fantasy points per game on the season, off of 17.5 rush attempts per game and 2.5 pass targets per game. He scored 19 fantasy points off of 16 rush attempts and 4 pass targets last week. He's only going to be about 3% owned here. He's on the field for 62% of the snaps, and he touches the ball 41% of that time. He's projected at 18.5 fantasy points here in week 3. He's 6,800 DraftKings salary and 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43.5 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 6.5. So he's got the best running back matchup on the slate. This should be a running game script. Remember, Carolina Panthers don't have Christian McCaffrey, so that is a huge blow to the Carolina Panthers offense. I think Austin Eckler runs all over this team here in week 3, so I like Austin Eckler here versus the Carolina Panthers. Now, with those injuries in mind, Christian McCaffrey is out, and also for the San Francisco 49ers, Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman are out. So Jerick McKinnon from the San Francisco 49ers playing the New York Giants, he could be a low salary, low ownership play here. He's going to get more work here in week 3. And then Mike Davis from the Carolina Panthers playing the LA Chargers, he's going to get more work here in week 3. Mike Davis scored 16 fantasy points off of 8 pass targets and 1 rush attempt last week. So those pass targets are encouraging, especially on DraftKings where you get the full point per reception. He could be a nice play. So keep an eye on Mike Davis and Jerick McKinnon as some lower ownership plays here that may get more volume due to injuries at the running back position.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet. that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I like DK Metcalf from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DK Metcalf has averaged 19.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 targets per game. He scored 19 and 20 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks off of 6 and 8 pass targets. He's going to be about 15% owned, and he's on the field for 99% of the snaps, touching the ball 11% of that time, projected at 15.7 fantasy points here in week 3. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary and the same price on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 57 points scored in this game with the Seattle Seahawks favored by 5. This is a great matchup. This guy gets tons of red zone targets. He's one of my favorite fantasy wide receivers. So I like DK Metcalf here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now in that same game, this is a great game to stack because of the high projected point total by Vegas. They think there's going to be a ton of points scored in this game. So I like Amari Cooper from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Amari Cooper has averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game on the season off of 11.5 pass targets per game. He scored 19 and 18 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks off of 9 and 14 pass targets. So a ton of volume for Amari Cooper, who's going to be about 19% owned. He's on the field for 93% of the snaps, touching the ball 16% of that time. He's projected at 16.6 fantasy points here in week 3. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary and $500 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 57 points scored in this game with the Dallas Cowboys trailing by 5. Could be a passing game script for the Cowboys here as they play from behind versus the Seattle Seahawks. Fantastic matchup. So I like Amari Cooper here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, if you're looking for a lower salary wide receiver here, take a look at Deontay Johnson from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Houston Texans, who have the 6th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Deontay Johnson has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 11.5 pass targets per game. He scored 23 fantasy points last week off of 13 pass targets. So a ton of volume for Deontay Johnson, who's going to be about 13% owned, on the field for 84% of the snaps, touching the ball 21% of that time. He's projected at 14.3 fantasy points here in week 3. He's $5,400 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. So I like Deontay Johnson here versus the Houston Texans. Oh, real quick, Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game with the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 4. So yeah, I like Deontay Johnson here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, let's take a look at the tight end position. I like Zach Ertz from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Zach Ertz has averaged 10 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game. He scored 9 and 11 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks off of 7 pass targets in each of those games. He's going to be about 19% owned, on the field for 90% of the snaps, touching the ball 11% of that time. He really hasn't had a huge breakout game yet. He is projected at 13 fantasy points here in week 3, and he's $5,100 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Eagles favored by 5. So I think Zach Ertz has a breakout game here in week 3. So I like Zach Ertz here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, if you're looking for a low salary tight end here, take a look at Logan Thomas from the Washington football team playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Logan Thomas has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.5 pass targets per game. He scored 7 and 14 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks off of 9 and 8 pass targets. So tons of volume. He's going to be about 12% owned. He's on the field for 82% of the snaps, touching the ball 15% of that time, projected at 9.6 fantasy points here in week 3. And he's only $3,700 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, and they have the Washington football team trailing by 7.5. So it should be a passing game script for Washington. He's got a fantastic matchup here. He's low salary, tons of volume. So I like Logan Thomas here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, and now this is just kind of a gut pick here. It's not a great matchup, but I like Evan Ingram from the New York Giants playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing tight ends. And Evan Ingram has only averaged 7.7 fantasy points per game on the season, but he's getting 7.5 pass targets per game. He scored 13 fantasy points last week off of 8 pass targets. And remember, Saquon Barkley went down. He's going to be out this week. So I think Evan Ingram is going to be featured here. I think he's going to get a ton of volume, and he's only going to be about 2% owned. I think that ownership is just way too low. He's on the field for 95% of the snaps, touches the ball 12% of that time. He's projected at 11.4 fantasy points here in week 3. He's $5,000 DraftKings salary and $900 FanDuel salary. And $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the Giants trailing by 3.5. So it should be a passing game script for the New York Giants. Even though the San Francisco 49ers have a ton of injuries, they probably still have a better team, but it should be pretty close, I guess. Competitive game here. So I like Evan Ingram here versus the San Francisco 49ers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video, or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.